Okay, guys, here we go. So on It's Learning, you've got the nutrient cycles quiz up. You can follow right along as we go. If you want to write some notes down, that's awesome too. You can use those on the test. Um, let's dive into nutrient cycles. After we finish this up, by the way, we're going to be running down to lab to do a lab. So this won't take us very long. We're just going to go through some of the cycles that are happening on our planet. So all of the atoms and molecules that make up our bodies today get constantly recycled throughout the environment. So that's what we mean by nutrient cycles. The stuff that's in you, the carbon, the oxygen, the phosphorus, the nitrogen, the H2O, it just keeps going round and round and round. In fact, you might find it intriguing, interesting, neat, gross, but the water that's coursing through your veins is the same exact water that coursed through the veins of dinosaurs, right? It's the same water that was in the body of Socrates. It just keeps getting recycled over and over and over again, and we all just keep reusing this stuff, right? So it's been here pretty much since the early times of Earth, unless new stuff comes in from a comet or something. This is the matter that just keeps getting recycled that makes up our bodies and allows us to live. So let's look at a couple of these cycles that are kind of key to biology. Okay, so think about how energy moves through an ecosystem, right? We've got the sun, and everything starts with the sun, like we talked about before. Plants, of course, absorb that energy. Some of it gets released as heat. Okay. Then consumers, of course, consume the plants, like this ant here. And, of course, some of that material that they have consumed turns to heat, and they release that as heat as well. Remember, they only get 10% of what energy is available to them from each level down that they feed. We can look over here. As things die, they decompose based on the use of fungi, and bacteria will decompose things, those decomposers. And that kind of forms this inorganic nutrient pool of all this rotten stuff that everything else uses. And it all just keeps cycling around. But it all starts with the sun, right? And I think everybody recognizes that. We've talked about that quite a bit. But life couldn't exist if we didn't share these nutrients and move them around. We are all completely interconnected. Right? Every organism on this planet is interconnected through these cycles. Let's start with the water cycle. This is the easiest cycle. You've probably learned this in grade school, water cycle. We might add a few new terms here. So let's just sort of work our way through it. The majority of Earth's water is in the ocean, right? Water everywhere, not a drop to drink. We can't drink ocean water, right? The salt is not okay for us to drink. You'll die if you are on the open ocean and all you drink is the ocean water. But it is where the majority of our water is on our planet. So where does the fresh water come from? Well, ocean water can evaporate. Okay? It can end up in the atmosphere, and that's what we see as clouds. Clouds are condensed water up there in the atmosphere. And as it condenses in the clouds, it can precipitate, which means to fall down as snow, sleet, hail, whatever have you, onto the Earth's surface. And then some of it runs off through streams, off into the ocean again. Here's some runoff over here, surface runoff. Some of it percolates down into the soil and ends up down here in the water table and moves through the ground underground. All of our water in Columbus comes from groundwater. We dig wells down and we pump it up, and that's the water that we drink, right? But it has to come from water infiltrating on the land and going through all that rock and all that soil to get down to the water table. The last one up here that I want to really mention is something called evapotranspiration, or just transpiration. So evapotranspiration is the combination of both evaporation and this thing that plants do called transpiration. So transpiration is, in some respects, just basically plant sweat. So when plants do photosynthesis, they've got the sun on their leaves and they're bringing up water from their roots, they give off water. Water comes out of their leaves. In fact, one way to actually get water in nature is to put a plastic bag over a plant, as long as it's not poison ivy or something toxic, seal it off at the bottom, and the plant will transpire and fill the bag up with water. As long as it's not leaking out the bottom, if you can tip the plant over, you can get some water that way that's actually clean that you can drink. As long as the plant's not poisonous, right? Wouldn't want to do that one with poison ivy. So this is the water cycle. Does everybody understand what transpiration is? Everybody have that one? Slow me down if I'm going too fast here. But that's some water returning to the atmosphere from plants. Okay, so the water cycle is just moving back to the oceans, back and forth between the oceans, essentially. So let's talk carbon. carbon is one of the most important elements on our planet because we're all carbon-based, right? It's the only element that we know of that can form complex stuff like DNA. So when we say, if you've watched Star Trek, any Star Trekkies in here? No? So if you watch Star Trek and they talk about carbon-based life forms, we're all carbon-based life forms, even down to the tiniest bacteria. We have never found a type of life based on something other than carbon. Now there's a bleak possibility, small possibility, that the molecule, the atom silicon, could potentially take on some of the similar roles that carbon does. So we might, on other planets, search for something like silica-based life, which would be kind of interesting. Nobody knows if that's really possible or not, but everything on our planet is based on carbon, right? And you're familiar with carbon. It's what makes up diamonds. It's also what makes up coal, right? But it makes up significant parts of our bodies. So let's look at the carbon cycle, okay? The carbon cycle, this is just how carbon cycles through the atmosphere, okay? So if we look over here, let's see. Let's start at industry and agriculture. So when we burn this stuff, when we burn coal or wood or anything, we release carbon dioxide back up into the air, which we all know is kind of bad because it makes the earth warmer, right? We wouldn't want none of it up there because then we'd all freeze to death. But right now we've got too much of it up there. And it's from our burning of fossil fuels in our cars, in our industry, right? So that's the CO2 in the atmosphere, okay? The way that this stuff gets back down into the living system is primarily through photosynthesis. So check this out. Plants, through photosynthesis, can take carbon dioxide in through their leaves. They pull off photosynthesis and they chain the carbons together to make glucose, which has a whole bunch of carbons in it. It's a big carbon chain. And glucose is sugar, right? And so we're all after the sugar. So whether we eat plants or eat something that ate plants, we're stealing the carbon that was originally in the air out of the plants or what ate them. Okay? And it moves through other parts of the system as well. When plants and animals decompose, of course, our carbon returns to the earth. It could become fossil fuels again if it's buried for long enough. It also ends up in the oceans. Okay? It can end up in the oceans, and it kind of diffuses in and out of the ocean water. It can kind of go both ways. But the oceans are a big carbon sink as well, hold quite a bit of carbon. Basically, every living creature on this planet is holding on to carbon. If all the life on this planet were to die and release our carbon at once to the atmosphere, the Earth would get really hot. Right? So we're all carbon sinks in a way. Let's see here. Everybody got that question there, the second one? Good. Parts of the carbon cycle. We just went through all of them there. Okay. So I put up here, respiration by animals produces CO2. So when you breathe out, you make carbon dioxide. And then photosynthesis by plants uses CO2. So we're in this sort of balanced relationship, plants and animals are. Like we take care of each other. Those ecosystem in the jars that we made, the plant in there is taking up the carbon dioxide that the little animals that you can't see, most of them are microscopic, are producing. And it's converting that, of course, into oxygen, which the animals are going to use. So there's this balance that's going on where we trade stuff. Okay. Oceans. Yep, we just talked about the oceans being a big carbon sink. They hold a lot of CO2. They help kind of scrub it off of our planet. If we look at the way that things flow through here, right, burning of fossil fuels, up to carbon in the atmosphere, and of course to plants and other life. Okay, life requires nitrogen as well. It's another one of the big elements that's really important. It's in our bodies, it's in our amino acids, it's in DNA, RNA, vitamins. There's a lot of places you have nitrogen in your bodies. So let's look at the nitrogen cycle. Oh, you'll hear this word numerous times when we start to talk about DNA. But the bases on DNA, you might have heard of A's, T's, C's, and G's. Heard that before? Adenine, cytosine, thymine, guanine. Those are all referred to as nitrogenous bases because they have nitrogen. Okay, so nitrogen's important down at the level of our DNA. Let's look at how we get nitrogen into our bodies. Okay. So the nitrogen cycle is kind of interesting in a sense because the only way, put this back up here, there we we go. The only way to get nitrogen through the living cycle is through bacteria. So the only way that this gets back into the living cycle is through bacteria. So there's loads of nitrogen in our air, in our atmosphere, but you breathe it all the time. 78% of the air you breathe is not oxygen, it's nitrogen. It doesn't hurt you, but you can't use it. Even though you know you need it for your DNA and for everything in your body, you don't get to use the nitrogen you're breathing. It just goes in and out. In order to get into your bodies, you have to consume it. You've got to eat it from plants and other animals. So how does it get into them? Well, when something dies and decomposes, okay, the elements that make it up enter back into the soil. There are special bacteria called nitrogen-fixing bacteria because they can fix nitrogen either out of the soil or even sometimes right out of the air into a form that's essentially plant fertilizer known as nitrates. Okay. I'm not going to get complex and make you remember nitrates and nitrides and all that stuff, but they can convert it into a plant form that plants can use. Has anybody ever heard of like nitrogen fertilizer? If you fertilize plants, what you put on them, if it's not manure, which does contain loads of nitrogen, is essentially nitrogen-based stuff that plants can use. So this is how it gets back into the ecosystem. Then we eat it, and it goes round and round. But the key to this is bacteria. So let me ask you this. If you have to have nitrogen in your body, right, everything does, could you have existed on Earth before bacteria existed on Earth? Ain't no way. Bacteria had to be here before peoples were here. Had to be here before rabbits were here, before deer were here, before worms were here, because the only way to get nitrogen into any of those bodies is bacteria. It's the only way that it works. So bacteria are, as much as they're dangerous, they're pretty essential things as well. Right? There we go. Come on, there we are. So let's look at phosphorus now. On to the next one there. Oh, you got through all the nitrogen cycle questions. Oh, I guess that was the last question on the test. So this is the last cycle we're going to talk about here. The phosphorus cycle is also pretty unique. We do have, our DNA contains phosphorus. In fact, the backbone of our DNA, this little windy stringy thing, okay, is known as the sugar phosphate backbone. So there's all these phosphate molecules in there. So phosphorus is really important to life. Like we can't have DNA without this stuff, and RNA without this stuff. It's important to a lot of things. Let's look at where phosphorus comes from. So phosphorus cycle is unique in the sense that it's the only cycle that depends entirely, for the most part, on rocks. How about that? You've got to have rocks to have phosphorus, because what happens is the phosphorus is locked up inside of the rocks on land. And when they weather away and erode, the phosphorus dissolves out of the rocks and washes into the oceans, into the lakes, into the soil, okay, where plants can then pick that up and use it. And then as they decompose, the decomposers also release it, and the animals that eat the plants can use it. But the key here really, the unique thing about the phosphorus cycle is that it relies on rocks. Part of the time, phosphorus is in rocks. Have you guys heard of plate tectonics? Yeah, okay, good, yes. Good thing for plate tectonics. It seems like kind of an interesting thing. It's kind of cool, whatnot, that these plates move around on our planet. If plate tectonics stopped, we would all die. Isn't that strange? Like, it's something that you wouldn't even think about. If bacteria didn't exist, we would all die. But if plate tectonics stopped going, if volcanoes stopped forming, and the Earth stopped moving like that, if its core cooled off, there would be no phosphorus cycle, because that's how new rocks get made, and then they wear down. I mean, it would take a while, believe me, but just recognize that rocks are essential to life on our planet. And that's kind of a neat thing. So we went through all the cycles. Hopefully you guys remember that stuff. Answer your quiz, hit complete, and we're going to move on to the lab.